Troy, Michigan, just before the first shutdown last year, public interest group Voters Not Politicians talking election reform, term limits in particular.
But of all of these states that have done it, Michigan has by far the most restrictive term limits.
Michigan, like 14 other states, limits how long legislators can hold office.
You know, I think it's very clear that it was a failed experiment.
Nearly 3 decades ago, Patrick Anderson helped lead the fight for term limits statewide.
Take me back to 1992. What was going on back then?
In 1992, Michigan citizens were upset with out-of-control government, just like they are now.
Where were you guys on term limits at that time? How did you feel about it?
Bob, remember the whole mail scandal with John Dingell and Barbara Rose Collins? It was a whole mail scandal.
Yeah, the banking scandal.
Washington, the House banking and post office scandals, Congress people co-opting taxpayer money, spurring talk of term limits. Though many tried, it wouldn't apply to Congress. Term limits were slapped on state legislatures instead.
I was all in favor of having term limits for state legislators because I didn't think we'd ever beat Dominic Jacobetti. I thought he'd be around forever as the appropriations king in the State House of Representatives.
Dominic Jacobetti had held his seat since 1955, 37 years by then, an Upper Peninsula Democrat. Imagine that.
Jacobetti ruled the roost. If you want something done, you get a hold of Jacobetti.
Term limits didn't officially start till 1998. House members held to 3 two-year terms, senators serving only 2 four-year stints, a total of 14 years.
What term limits really does is break up the power from just a few people and puts it in the hands of more people. And that's what we want with our government. You don't want government where the power is concentrated in the hands of a few people because it's easier to be abused.
So nearly a quarter century later, where are we now?
Upon reflection, I felt that much like Ed, 3 two-year terms in the State House of Representatives in particular was much too short.
Term limits didn't necessarily solve the problems they were intended to, and they created a new problem because the legislators who had less experience were less likely to be responsive to their voters, and they were less likely to have the kind of experience that would allow them to stand up to governors and lobbyists.
A study by Wayne State University researchers made the case that lobbyists have gained more influence because of term limits. Others beg to differ. State Rep Steve Johnson is from West Michigan.
You know, when I was elected back in 2016, reforming our no-fault system was such a huge issue to people that I talked to when I was knocking doors in my campaign. But when you had a lot of people that were new, they're saying, well, I don't really care what the interest groups in Lansing say. I don't care if this hasn't been done in the past. I think we can do it now. And that's what term limits allows those fresh ideas that haven't been pushed down by the interest groups, but instead they're really fighting for their community.
And it is so.
Auto insurance reform signed by the governor in 2019.
Some of the premier pieces that I worked on was all the legislation for autonomous vehicles.
Former state senator Mike Cole wanted to help local companies lead the way in self-driving cars. He got it done in 2016, but he thinks that term limits forcing out legislators had become, well, problematic.
This is not simple stuff. I mean, how do term limits affect that kind of legislation, do you think?
Well, you know, probably somebody coming in right off, from the general public coming in wouldn't even know to begin to work on that unless they were nurtured by another legislator or had an intimate working knowledge of, engineering and that sort of thing. And we don't have a lot of engineers coming into the legislature.
Steve Bita was first elected in 2002.
I had about over 50 public acts in my career. One of the bigger ones was dealing with compensation for people who were wrongfully convicted.
Bita worked that bill, 6 years in the House, 6 more in the Senate. Turnover meant educating more new faces each election cycle.
The fact that it took as long as it did, it was like a 12-year endeavor. I don't think that would have taken as long if it wasn't for term limits hampering it.
If you were to change them, would you get rid of them? Would you extend them? What's your position on that?
I think at this point in time, I would extend them 3 or 4 terms in the Senate and then the equal amount in the House. And then I would alternate them so that we wouldn't be losing everybody all at one time, because there's a tremendous brain drain that goes on.
How hard would it be to change the term limits that we have now?
It would require a constitutional amendment to change the term limits that we have now. So that would mean a ballot initiative.
A ballot initiative, daunting and expensive. Now, Sarpolis, the Democrat, and LABRANT, the Republican, are pushing an idea.
And this year I began to do some work in Rochester Hills. And one thing I was looking at the way they run their government.
There are term limits in Rochester Hills too.
But the quirk in city charter, the fact is that after the 2 terms, if you want to run for a 3rd term, you're going to have to basically win by a write-in ballot.
Rochester Hills Mayor BRYAN is in his 4th term because residents keep writing him in.
And the campaign was really about, it was very important, not why you should vote for me, but how you should vote for me.
So we thought we'd make a quick video to show you just how simple it is.
99.5% of people had never written anyone in a ballot before. So it was a massive education campaign. In that election in 2015, I took, I think, 54% of the vote not being on the ballot.
Sarpolis and LABRANT would like to get the legislature to take something like this to Michigan voters this fall.
And there's a lot of people that feel that the term limits have kind of inhibited better government.
But you know what? I think the people that think term limits has inhibited better government should go forward and make that argument like we did in 1992.
Patrick Anderson has been a real critic of attempts to overturn term limits, but when he heard about our particular proposal, he didn't dismiss it out of hand. He thought it was kind of an interesting concept.
When I heard Ed Sarpolis and Bob LABRANT were getting together, I thought they're 2 of the most experienced, knowledgeable political people that I know. I'll probably talk with them about it because those are 2 interesting guys and I like to hear what they have to say.
Well, what about just altering what we have, make them a little bit longer?
That's the camel wants to get his nose under the tent so they can get all the way in. The same people who are always talking about just changing them a little bit, they want to change them a lot.
I think in the end of the day, you come in, you serve your community, you do your job, and you go back home.
I would get this all the time though, when I was term limit out, was people like, well, we're really sorry to see you go. You've done a great job. You've been super good part of the community. But at the same time, they would say, we really like term limits. It's almost like, well, we like it for the other guy, or we like it for the people we don't know. But for the people we know, we don't really like it. So maybe the write-in idea would be a good idea.